Good morning, Dr. Mazzula, and good morning, Dr. Moreno. Welcome to the last session for Room 5 today. I'm going to have Dr. Diana Rodriguez Moreno introduce the presenter for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Mazzula. Dr. Mazzula is an award-winning educator, scholar mentor, and mental health researcher who specializes on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's an associate professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Her current research focuses on racial trauma, diverse academic pipeline development, and Latino mental health, with particular attention to socio-cultural identities and race and culture as a psychological and subconscious processes of human thought and behavior. Dr. Mazzula is an expert in developing process, benchmark measures, and systemic guidelines to assess equitable, inclusive, and culturally responsive research and scholarship, and in social framework evaluation of discrimination and inclusiveness in the workplace. She has received various awards, including Distinguished Faculty Teaching and Outstanding Scholarly Mentorship Award by John Jay College, and the Emergent Researcher Award by the New Jersey Psychological Association. She's also the Executive Director of the Latina Researchers Network and the former President of the Latino Psychological Association of New Jersey. Please, Dr. Mazzula, the word is yours.
It's one of those days when things just don't seem to quite go according to plan. Thank you for the privilege to be here. It's very exciting. I was in the wrong room, but things happen for a reason, because that session was also talking about the issues that I'm going to be discussing today, which is really about race and how race is treated in psychology research, specifically how South Americans and Central Americans and those who identify either as Latinx heritage or Hispanic heritage live in the United States, how they are included as participants, and how do we really understand issues of race with that population. Okay, so essentially the purpose is to really center race and culture in psychological research. We know a lot about race, but very little as it relates to Latinx, at least in the United States. We do know that psychosocial determinants of health impact well-being. So there's problems related to healthcare for those two, and I'm going to say Latinx or Hispanic just to keep it simple, but it's anyone in the United States. I'm specifically looking at the psychology journals, the scholarship that comes out of the United States, including anyone that's heritage, Hispanic, Latino, South American, Central American. So we see that there's disparities in health, disparities in educational outcome. There's also disparities in employment. Latinos, for example, are the highest in terms of service jobs and the lowest in terms of professional jobs. A lot of it, there's a lot of disparities across pretty much every system in the United States. And I would argue everywhere else too, but we're not gonna go there quite yet. In the United States, this particular population has additional barriers, including adapting to the US Western culture. Whether or not they were born here, they're third generation here, or they were born outside of the United States, we see that the population has increased stress, sometimes race-based trauma, acculturation stress, depression, a lot of things going on when it comes to adapting to the US culture. For many years, the United States, the way that we looked at people coming into the United States was that immigrants had to adapt, assimilate, right? So change your last names. We saw that a lot for a long time. Immigrants would come here and change their last names. Families would not speak their native language when at home because they wanted their children to learn English. So there was a lot of letting go of of anything related to the cultural heritage. We have moved away from that, noting that letting go of who you are actually increases mental health problems. What is really concerning, we know very little about Latinos or Hispanics in general in psychological research. What we know less about and very little about is the role of race in their experiences, mental health, health outcomes. What we know here so far is that light skin and darker skin communities have different experiences. Those who are dark skin, Latinx or Hispanics, or Black Latinx or Hispanics experience being marginalized, experience discrimination. And we argue, I do other work on race-based trauma, that Latinos who are dark skinned or Black will experience the same type of stress and trauma that other Black populations experience. I say that because in the United States, when we think of Black, we think of African-American, primarily African-American. Latinos are somehow not in there. And there's always been an issue on whether Hispanic Latino is a race, Uruguayan, I was born in Uruguay, whether it's a race or not. It's very confusing, the state, including the census in the United States. So there's very little focus on this particular population in general, but specifically as it relates to issues of race. So being Hispanic, Latino, going back and forth, is really much more complex. And it includes an interplay of culture, race, ethnicity. And this quote comes from, there's a lot of conceptual or theoretical discussions about what it means to be Hispanic or Latino, but not much in terms of data or quantitative work. So there's a lot of anecdotal, but there's very little research. Some of what we do know, and these are some of the studies that I've done looking at race specifically and skin color. So you don't have to worry about all of this. But what I looked here was among Latinos in the United States, whether immigrants or foreign born, I looked specifically at skin color, those who identified as light brown, white, or Black among the Latino population. And what we saw here is that ethnic cultural competence, so feeling positive about their cultural, their background, was related to skin color, in that those who were Black Latinos or Black Hispanic felt more connected, for lack of a better word, to their ethnic culture, whether it's Bolivian, Peruvian, whatever the case might be. English competence, those who felt comfortable in the language in the United States, had a different impact. That was white Latinx or Hispanics, regardless of their ethnic background. So here's just a little clips of skin color and the role of skin color in how people live and navigate the United States. I've also looked at microaggressions, which is little subtle things that people say to Latinos, to any racial group, that are really, they have a negative connotation, although the person may not be aware. So, for example, for a lot of immigrants, Latinos in the United States, we might hear comments like, "You're so articulate." And usually what that means is you're so articulate to be a person of color. And what we found, this is a study on looking at microaggressions, and we found that microaggressions in the United States differ depending on country of origin. So before we were talking about skin color, now we're talking about country of origin. So any Puerto Ricans experience being treated as criminals, as second-class citizens. Those who are born outside of the United States are treated as inferior. And there's also a lot of exoticizing. So especially looking at women as, sexy Latinas, or the Latino, I don't even know what it's called, when they call Latino men. The word is skipping. But being exoticized is lower is more among those with lower levels of education and people who are from the Dominican or have a Dominican background. So these subtle things are not things that the literature is looking at quite. And so we wanted to know, how are they looking at it? How are they looking at all these differences? And what do we know? So for the past 30 years of research, so 3 decades of research, psychological research across different fields have shown that there's been an increase in reporting race and ethnicity when we're talking about participants. However, in these 30 years, the main focus has been on just including numbers. So 100 Blacks, 100 whites, or 100 people from Mexico, or 100 people from Europe, I don't know, Italy. It's always just focused on the numbers. And I argue that's a huge limitation, because by simply including population, especially Latinos who are so diverse, as this one group, is a huge disservice, and it's not scientific. So I just swore. This is something I always show my students, and I just love this slide. Psychology is weird. We know that psychology impacts, psychology is all over the world. We understand everything through the lens of psychology. At least I do, as a counseling psychologist by training. The majority of psychological research or theories that we know to date are really informed by a Western society, a society that's educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And I always add white, male, heterosexual. The majority of participants, this is a cross-cultural study, the majority of participants are from the United States, are psychology undergraduate students. That's a huge problem. So what do we really know about mental health? Previous. So this is a study, a 16-year review of, this is 2 parts. The first part I did in general around forensic psychology related journals. One of the reasons being is that there's an increase in Latinx populations in the criminal justice system. Not to focus on that, but I'm in a forensic psychology department, so that was one of the things that I was interested. I do not want to stereotype Latinos as that. So we looked at the top 3 clinical forensic related journals. We also looked at counseling and applied psychology journals. So some of the top journals in counseling being at the forefront of issues of social justice historically. We looked at how are participants included, those frequencies, what kind of racial and cultural variables were included, and conceptually, how did they understand issues of race? Very simple what we found. We looked at 2,070 peer-reviewed studies across 16 years. These are not conceptual, these are just straight studies. They had to have at least one participant. They had to follow the empirical methodology, etc. 36% included Hispanics in all these clinical related, so applied in counseling. looking at ethnicity, about 4% of them included the ethnic background of the population. The articles that included Hispanics, it increased to 13%. Language, less than 1%. Place of birth, race, generation status, about 2%. When we looked at forensic related journals, so stop clinical forensic journals, ethnicity reporting was about 7%. And this is not identity. This is simple demographic characteristics. Language, less than 3%. Race, place of birth, generation, less than 1%. This is a huge problem. In terms of identity, the way that I understand race is I look at race through the lens of identity. So race, there's different ways to look at race. Race could be a demographic, socio-demographic variable. You ask someone, what's their racial group? They say Black. Some people say American. But it's what the person answers. And then the identity, racial identity specifically, is how one understands themselves as in a subconscious psychological level, how one understands themselves as a racial being and how they interact with the world. Identity research says a lot more about a person. So you can look at me and ask me, what's my race? I might say, well, this is the issue with Latinos, right? Light skin. I have light skin. Ask me about my color. That doesn't tell you whether I navigate the world easily or not, whether I have internalized racism or not, right? My racial identity would. So we looked at identity in these 3,000 plus studies. Less than 1% included anything related to racial identity, ethnic identity, cultural identity, acculturation, gender identity. And then with the articles that included, with the studies that included Latino participants, less than 2%. That means we're looking at this population as if they are one homogeneous group. And we know from the previous presentation, they were speaking about racism. We know racism has a major impact on psychological well-being, health outcomes. There's tons of data that has proven that. Yet we're not looking at that. And it's funny because I have a 15-year-old, and I was telling him today that I was going to do this presentation and that I was going to talk about the difference between outcomes in Latino communities based on race. And he looked at me like I was insane. Like, what do you mean? And I said, well, my study shows that not a lot of people are looking at race when it comes to our community. And we're from Uruguay, and I have Afro descendant on one side of the family, and then white, Italian on another. So my son's response was, I don't get it. I mean, put a Black Uruguayan and then a white Uruguayan, and hello, what is there to explain? They're different. So he couldn't understand why psychology doesn't get it. So less than 2% is a huge disservice. Of those that did look at race, what I really wanted to know is, when studies include race, what do they do with it in the whole study, not just in the methodology? And what we found is that 94% just consider race as something that's demographic. They'll talk about, you know, Mexicans, but they don't say anything about identity. 3% look at it in terms of cultural deprivation. Cultural deprivation means that the Latinx, Latino population is compared to a white standard group in how they compare or not. The assumption is that the norm is the normal, healthy way. And so where do these populations kind of fit according to this comparison group? Counseling psychology doesn't do a lot of using white comparison groups, but I know there's other fields that are really heavily rely on this. And it's from a social justice perspective, is looking at a community as a cultural deprivation. Then there was 2% of articles or studies that looked at differences. They just said, well, here's Mexicans, here's Puerto Ricans, how are they different? But really very little understanding of what that means for the population. What does it mean for their mental health? How do we understand it? How do we move forward? And only 1% actually, there was only 8 studies that focused a whole article on one sub-Latinx group, only one, and tried to understand, I mean, only 1%, and tried to understand that community from that community's perspective. Again, this is a disservice. You can't see that. Let me just check my time. I'll pause for a second. You can't see this. I am sorry, it was in the transferring of the PowerPoint. In last year, I did another study to see if maybe there was just something off with, I'm gonna close this for a second so I can, so I can't make it bigger. So this is the Journal of Latinx Psychology. It was a special issue on Afro-Latinx. And I served as the editor along with 2 of my colleagues. And I also included, published one specific study, which really followed the same methodology of the study that I just reviewed of the 16 years. But this time, I wanted to know, is there something related to just journals that are not focused on racial or diversity issues? What about journals that are Latino focused, that are for Latinos or published by Latinos or are meant to inform any kind of psychological issue, research, policy, whatever it may be related to Latinos? So the journals that were included were the Journal of Hispanic Behavioral Sciences and the Journal of Latinx Psychology. The Journal of Hispanic Behavioral Science is a pretty well-known journal, and it's a pretty old journal as it relates to publications here. So we looked at 800 articles, research studies after removing duplicates, etc. Here we looked at quantitative studies, qualitative studies, mixed method studies across both journals. Oh my goodness, my slides. So I'll just give it, is there a way that I could? Okay. The Journal of Behavioral Sciences. Is this a color? I really have to just highlight this. In the Journal of his Behavioral Sciences, I can't highlight it. It's not letting me. Someone doesn't want me to talk about this. Okay, nope. So you see that? I'm trying to highlight under HJBS, inclusion of Afro-Latinx participants. Do you see that? 1.7. Oh goodness, I am messing up here. Okay, I'll just talk about it. I don't know what I did with my slides. I told you today is just one of those days. So you don't have to get overwhelmed by all of this. In the journal of, in the Hispanic Journal of Behavioral Sciences, we see that there's 1.7% of the studies published in this journal that include Black Latinos, Afro-Latinos, any participant, any study that included any kind of way to show that they had included dark-skinned, Black, Afro-descendant Latinos. 4 articles, 4 studies out of 242. In the Journal of Latinx Psychology, 2 studies out of 108. That's a huge problem. If we look at the bottom, which is looking at race as a psychological measure, understanding how people internalize oppression, internalize racism, how do they navigate the world? 2 articles in the Journal of Latinx Psychology, 2 in the Hispanic Journal of Behavioral Sciences. They were a little better, including skin color, okay? When we're looking at qualitative and mixed method studies, I don't even have to go through the numbers. They're so limited. It's quite alarming, quite alarming. I had some examples, and unfortunately the slides just, I can't apologize enough. I'll read some of them. Here's just, I'm getting dizzy by looking at this blurry slide, so that's why I keep pausing. These are some of the examples of how researchers report issues of race. And I'll give you 2, I'll read 2 of them. The first one is the racial ethnic background of the sample was as follows: 50% Caucasian, 26% African-American, 18% Latino, 6% other. So here you see the huge issue, right? Latino, are we talking about Afro-descendant Black Latinos? Are we talking about white Latinos? They will have a completely different experience based on what we know of Afro-descendant communities. The final sample of 23,000 patients was distributed between non-Hispanic Blacks, non-Hispanic whites, and Hispanics. So researchers really do a good job at differentiating Blacks are not Hispanic and whites are not Hispanic, but they don't with Hispanics, okay? Participants racially identified as white, Black, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, and provided no race or identified with one or more race. Where's Latinos there? They did say Latinos somewhere there based on country of origin. For race, again, don't look at this because this is really awful. For race, so the one that I just mentioned was in terms of ethnic, using ethnicity and race interchangeably. So while they're talking about, while researchers are reporting white race, when they're talking about Hispanics, they say Hispanic, which is an ethnic group, not a racial group. In terms of race, participants were 11 host community residents. This was a qualitative or mixed study. Although the host community residents were not asked to report race or ethnicity, all phenotypically looked white. So this researcher, even though the community that they were observing or doing a study on did not include anything related to the participants' race, the researcher went ahead and looked at what that person looked like and said they were perceived to be phenotypically white. Some of the ones that are good is of the men who reported their skin color, 46% were white, and there's light brown, dark brown, or Black. It makes a huge difference when we're talking about race or just the population in general, whether we include race or skin color, the outcomes are quite different. We know that, and we're doing a huge disservice in the psychological research. These were just examples, and I'd be happy to share the study. It was published last year so that you can actually see some of this better. So in terms of what to take away from this, there's been a lot of policies in the United States and I'm sure in other places, but I'm sticking to the United States. Hopefully that informs something. And if anything, it informs Guyana how little we know. And this is my opinion as a researcher in this area, how little we know about issues of race. And when I say we, I mean the United States. So we've had a lot of policies, whether it's the American Psychological Association issuing major cultural diversity reports, whether it's the American Psychological Association publication manual that has a specific section on how to adequately report sample characteristics, or whether it's NIH requesting researchers to include diverse populations in order to be funded. There's the Minority Health Institute. There's all these entities and policies in place. What this data says, whether it's clinical, forensic, applied, or journals specifically related to the population, policy has not shaped research. It is not shaping research. So there's a huge gap in scholarship, especially as it relates to psychosocial or psychological understandings of race and cultural variables. So we're including whether we had 100 Hispanics in 100 African Americans. But when you think about it, that's maintaining the status quo. That is adding information. And I hope I do not insult any other researcher that's present here throughout the world. This is just where we are as the state of the field. Is a status quo. We're including the participants because we must, but that is it. While acculturation has been pretty much studied with Latino and Asian American samples, very few studies include acculturation measures. So when we're including measures, when researchers are including measures, where they're trying to understand acculturation, what is being included mostly is proxy variables, whether someone was born in the United States or not, whether someone speaks Spanish or not. From a psychological perspective, neither of those tells you how that person psychologically navigates the world and how that's related to their mental health outcomes. Inclusion, not representative. We see, or the scholars, the researchers are including, there's an increase in reporting of sample characteristics. However, it's rare that they pass the methodology section, the sample characteristics, right? So they're included in the methodology, and that's where it stays. Their studies are not focused on the population. Very few are. We saw, I think it was less than 4% in some of the journals. So some of the recommendations, and these are pretty big recommendations. And I would be also happy to share this report that was published on Latino boys and men advancing scholarship and community-based solutions in the United States. So incorporate a psychological understanding of participants' racial and cultural identities. And this is, my bias is a psychologist, right? But we know that the psychological aspect of understanding race, culture, identity, racism, discrimination is all from a psychological perspective. Regardless of how you look, phenotypically wise, skin color, hair texture, it does not tell me how you see the world, how you feel about yourself being in that skin. And it's just 2 slides. I don't know why it keeps changing. I'm not going to touch it. So definitely incorporating a psychological understanding, and I would encourage the psychology field clearly, because we are not doing it, but also the other fields, epidemiology, public health. We all need to be on board on really trying to understand what it means to be a racial person being of Latinx background. Latinx people are all over the world, right? They're not just in the United States, and this has a huge impact on mental health. Establish the cultural appropriateness of the tools and measures that we are using. This is also for other racial, ethnic, minority, and I hate to use the minority word, but most of the measures and instruments that we use are based on that weird group, that weird plus group. So it's important for us, before we use any measure, any tool, it's really to make sure they're appropriate for the culture that we're studying. Promoting approaches and frameworks are culturally specific, strength-based, and that are community grounded, so the community can inform the researchers. At this point, psychology can't say we are, and I'll say it myself, at this point, even though this is my area of expertise, I cannot say that I know what Latinos or Hispanics experience and how it's related to their mental health, health outcomes, mortality rates, diabetes, hypertension, whatever it is that you want to plug in there. I cannot say I know much about it, even though there is a lot of scholarship, because a lot of it is not community grounded. Increase partnerships between academic and community-based organizations. What we saw in some of the work, especially in this report, is that a lot of community organizations are talking about these issues, are talking about Blackness and Afro-Latinidad and racism in Latino communities, but that is not being, I don't know what's going on, that is not being translated to researchers. So we need to have researchers, evaluators, community-based organizations together when we're doing any kind of research. Obviously, increase convergence between policy practice and community outcomes. And I'll leave this I think we have about 8 minutes for questions, even though we started a little late. Move away from studies and programs that juxtapose and compare European white Americans to Americans of color, and that frame research and effective community-based assessment using Western or European standards as the norm. The only way that we can do that is by increasing qualitative and community-based work, and that can't just stay in the community. It has to, that the gap between what's being published, the research that's being disseminated has to match what's going on in the community, and we have to do a much better job understanding Latinos, especially who have Afro descendancy, are dark skin or Black. And I will leave it there, and hopefully there's some questions, comments.
Thank you very much, Silvia. This was really, really interesting. I'm also from South America, as you noticed. I'm from Argentina, so we are kind of like from close countries. I will ask you myself a question, and if there are any questions, people can directly put the speakers on, unmute themselves and ask, or they can type it on the chat. I'm looking at the chat. I wonder, what you're saying is true. There is a lack of policy directing these issues. NIH mandates reporting, but not really including that more than in the methodology. And in many cases, I think that it's just a reporting based on what the NIH looks at, like what is the race, if it's Hispanics.
Correct.
So what would be the measures that researchers like myself that are looking at, like we look at transmission of trauma, for example, and we look at decision making and impulsivity in adolescents, what would be the measures that we could use to disentangle this, just not look at the race only, but maybe the degree of acculturation, or looking at the generation, like you said, second generation versus the first generation? What kind of tools could we actually use that will improve our understanding of the groups that we're working with?
So for the first part, and I'm sharing my screen, let's see. I will share in the chat before we end the two reports. One of the main things in terms of basic sample characteristics, and this always brings an issue in researchers saying, well, I can't ask about being Black or white because then there's not enough Latinos. There's not enough to understand. Unfortunately, it's not scientific not to do so. And I want to be just very blunt and devil's advocate in saying that. So one of the first things is that when we are including participants, it's really deconstructing the term Hispanic by generation status. And generation status as in first, second, third generation, whether it's asking, were you born here? Were your parents born here? Were your grandparents born here? And then the researcher codes a generation status from that. In terms of asking about race, ethnicity, I always have an open-ended, self-identified racial group, but I always ask for skin color. And you would be surprised at how often participants will say, white Hispanic or just Hispanic. And then when you look at their skin color, they're either dark or white, and it's different than how they reported. There's also a lot of confusion around what it means to be a racial group or an ethnic group in the United States, because Latinos are being kind of boxed into these dichotomous white, Black categories in the United States that are really based on African American, Black, and European, Caucasian, white. And so a lot of Latinos don't know exactly where they fit in that, because in other places, race is more fluid, right? There's a continuum of color, and there's other places where race is based on money. The more money you have, the whiter you are, right? So deconstructing race based on that participant section. In terms of measures, there are some measures, psychology measures on acculturation, on cultural values, because values is really big, racial identity. The measures that are currently, to my knowledge, the measures that are currently available for racial identity, so looking at race as a psychological variable, are really based on norm on African Americans or Blacks in the United States. Those that are focused on Latinos, the measures, to my knowledge, do not necessarily measure racial identity. So they might be called, a measure of that they measure identity, but it's usually about the language that you speak, kind of what language you watch TV in, do you know the people that are famous here versus over there? I don't think there's one yet.
I think that's an issue. It's a big issue that there are no things based on the Latino community. And like you said, most of the measures on psychology or psychiatry has been usually based on white populations.
Correct.
So,
yeah. So
transforming one to the next one is always an issue.
Correct.
Well, I think that I don't see any questions right now, and it's 11 o'clock, so I want to leave the room for the next talk, if there is a next talk. Thank you very, very much. It was a
Thank you, Diana. It's so great to meet you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diana Rodriguez Moreno and Dr. Silvia Mazzula. It was wonderful having you in here. And I thank my attendees for being here today for this session. So this is the end of the sessions for today, and we will start tomorrow again at 8 a.m. And we welcome you all to join us for the last session of the Environmental Health and Wellbeing Conference. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.